Hey, welcome to the Modscast. Speaking of that, I might need to change the name again. I was going to do Modcast, that was taken. I was going to do Modscast, that appears to also be used. So if you got any ideas, post them in the comments for what I can call this. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to talk to you about difference and indifference. This is something that's pretty vital. And I want to frame it so for those of you who continue to watch or are interested, it helps you to think about a lot of the stuff that's going on. I've talked many times, I'm a philosophical guy looking from things high above. So difference and indifference. The reason I want to talk about this is that essentially everything we know from its difference. If you think about even a dictionary, right? It's a bunch of words. You could get lost in a dictionary, but what does a word do but describe? So if I give you the definition of, say, a chair, well, that definition really just uses words to say everything that make a chair not something else, right? If that sounds confusing, stick with me a minute. When we encounter something new all the time, right, and we provide a name for it, what do? Well, we try to differentiate it from other things and to sort it out and go, okay, well, here's what this is. Think biology, for example, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It's a process of differentiation. How is it similar? How is it different? Okay, and that's how we distinguish. And when we encounter something new, we create a new word for it, right? Relative to other words. So internet, yeah, is an example of how we go about that. Now, the thing about it is we need difference, all right? And if you want an explanation of it from scriptural tradition in the Western tradition or literary tradition, say Milton's Paradise Lost, but more importantly, his source, the Bible, which suggests that the fall from Eden was a fall not into knowledge. It wasn't the tree of knowledge. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is, as Milton says in Areopagitica, the tree of knowledge of knowing good by evil, right? That whatever the state was before the fall, it was a state of indifference, where we didn't know the difference because we didn't know good and evil. We didn't know, right? But the fall is now to know difference, to know happiness by knowing sadness, etc. So we need difference, okay? Because indifference, or the eradication of difference, is insanity. What do I mean by that? Well, if you know the difference between what you do in public and what you do in private, say a person who doesn't know the difference between taking their clothes off in the middle of the street and doing so at home in the privacy of their own home, if they don't know the difference, well, that's an indifference, right? They're not seeing the difference. Now, if someone says, you want Coke or Pepsi, and you say, well, I'm indifferent, it means you don't see a difference, a harmless indifference, right? What it means is I don't see any difference between Coke or Pepsi, so either one will do, okay? But in those cases, it doesn't matter that much. But if we eradicate difference, we don't know. Our definitions fall apart. Now, without getting too deep into the weeds, of course, postmodernist philosophers, post-structuralist philosophers, I should say, particular Derrida, talks about difference and difference, and he talks about how language is about, for him, it's deferral. So when you define a word, you're just moving to another word, you're never actually getting at the thing, because there's no natural connection or necessary connection between words and things. So difference, he suggests, difference, this deferral is a constant state that we're in. Now, some can be led to believe, well, if that's the case, then nothing matters. But I always argue the opposite is true. In fact, everything matters, because we're all making the system function whenever we use it. Difference, yeah? But we need difference in order to understand the universe around us. That's how we make sense of things. A library, even an internet search, right? You do it by terms and categories which are differentiated, in which the more you refine your search, the more you differentiate it from other things, so that you can get knowledge in bits and pieces, and you can understand it relative to other things, all right? If it's all coming at you, and this is one of the problems with the information, it's all coming at us from the same source, it's very difficult for our brain to really process and own it, so that we're talking in some ways. And there's people who've talked about how technology and screens are rewiring the brain, essentially. We're talking about maybe changing what it means to know something, because knowing where to find it isn't the same as knowing it, if that makes any sense. There's a difference there, right? But we think that because we know where to find it on our phone or on the screen, that we know it. And that leads to a lot of our conflict, okay? So this is one of the reasons why this difference matters, the difference between knowing something and knowing where to find it. Now, the attempt to eradicate difference, and this is the thing, is on one level, we're all fundamentally similar, right, as human beings. But at the same time, we need our differences to know who we are. And if you think about growing up, you join different groups and different cliques, and socially, you know, at the high school scene, whether it's the geeks, the jocks, whatever, right? You differentiate. Then you go to university, maybe you join a sorority, right? These are groups that you use to, well, you're trying to figure out who you are. You're not necessarily sure which group you belong to, but you're looking for some kind of identity. And you do that by process of differentiation. That's how you know things, okay? And that's a normal thing, okay? Your religious affiliation or whatever. Those are all things that you use to differentiate yourself from other people. And so you know, okay, well, what does it mean to be Catholic? Or what does it mean to be an atheist or whatever? And what are those things but defined by, well, I believe this, I don't believe that, right? Which is what these other people believe. So I'm not one of them, but instead I'm one of these because I'm different. And that difference, again, helps us figure out who we are. Now, one of the crucial things that is interesting is there's difference, relative difference, and then there's absolute difference. Absolute difference is what a friend of mine used to call it, the difference that can't be told. And there's a reason why we say, oh, I can't tell the difference. Like if I hold up two sheets of paper, they're identical, and you say, oh, I can't tell the difference. It means you can't say it, which means you also can't think it, right? Because that's how difference works, and language works. So I can't tell the difference because there's no word for it. I mean, the only thing you can say is, well, one is not the other, right? Now, if we did a microscopic examination, you would find differences, right? If you refined your search, you could get down and go, okay, here's the difference, and then you would know it, and you would be able to tell the difference. Not that anyone would be particularly interested in the microscopic differences between two pieces of paper, but significantly, it's the ability to think the difference. But the problem, as I mentioned, is when you're indifferent, it's a form of insanity. Now, let's be careful with that. Like I said, the person who doesn't understand the difference between what they do in public and what they do in private, or how they're supposed to talk to their boss versus how they're supposed to talk to their children, that's a problem, right? That's indifference. You're not seeing a difference in how you're supposed to conduct yourself and what the situation is. Similarly, those who say that in the war on terror, for example, that we're just like the terrorists, okay? Well, not at all, right? There's a difference there. Now, are people being killed in both situations? Yes. Is it unfortunate? Absolutely. It's lamentable. But, you know, people who are indiscriminately blowing up innocent people in cafes or at concerts versus people who are getting their own people killed in order to try to hit the right people. That is to say, the people who are responsible, the guilty or dangerous people. There's a difference there. Okay, if we in the West wanted to indiscriminately destroy concerts and religious gatherings and whatnot, we could certainly do it better than anyone in the history of the world. So there is a difference, okay? And being able to see and appreciate and understand that difference, okay, is important. As I say to my students all the time, anybody can see similarity, anybody can see difference. Critical thinking and attention involves being able to see difference where there is apparent similarity and to see similarity where there is apparent difference. Okay. Now, a case can certainly be made for what we might call positive indifference. So if I say indifference is insanity, I need to qualify and clarify that, because certainly love your enemies is indifference. Dr. King manifested indifference. Significantly, though, he did not say that he didn't want people to be not to be judged. Rather, he said, not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So there's a difference. It isn't that you don't judge. It's that you don't judge based on the color of your skin. But you still judge the content of your character Dr. King understood that. Similarly, Christ, love your enemies. He was certainly not indifferent in the temple with the money changers, or when he called the Pharisees, right, you snakes, you vipers brood. Yeah, he understood a difference, and he understood the difference between being loving and being indulgent, being merciful and being indulgent, and that it was important to do that. So it is good. We'll say on the one hand, well, how can you be indifferent to the suffering of the poor? Okay, that's a strange thing. Indifference, in that case, you're saying you're seeing a difference where there is none. In other words, you're seeing a difference between yourself and the poor, so you don't care. Okay, and that may be the case. That's where seeing difference where there is none. But at the same time, to argue, for example, that two faiths that say Christianity is no different from Islam, okay, is an oversimplification. It's an indifference and it's a form of insanity. Or to say, and similarly, one could argue that to suggest that the treatment of animals is the same as the treatment of humans is a form of indifference, a relatively harmless one, but there is a difference between human beings and animals, okay? Should we be good and responsible in all situations? Absolutely we should, okay? But to suggest that, say, I remember there was a billboard, two facing billboards near my work one day, and one was Holocaust victims on a train, and the other was chickens in cages on the back of a truck. It was only up for about a week, and it was from PETA, and it was the suggestion that these were the same. That's insanity. I mean, that's indifference. It's ridiculous. And without getting into whether or not you can argue about how we shouldn't do that to chickens, but to suggest that they're the same thing is indifference, and it's insanity, okay? To suggest that people say, well, the Old Testament has this terrible stuff, look at that. And so when you talk about the Quran and whatnot, well, okay, but the Old Testament, there's a New Testament, right? And so Christianity has changed or evolved from that, right? Still regarded as Holy Writ and still has to find a way to deal with it, okay? But there has been an evolution, so there is a difference. Now, and similarly, there are a number, and I don't need to get into specifics, but there's a number of substantial differences. Now, it would be easier to say all religions are the same and all cultures are the same. But you have to understand that to even get to the position where you're saying all cultures are the same, you have to have been in a culture that is different and unique from every other one that's ever been. That in itself is a fundamental difference. So when the post-structuralists will argue, well, there's no truth and there's no morality and everything's relative, the only reason they're in a position to have tenured positions at universities is because of a society that sets up the possibility of truth and sets out to pursue it. All of their work stands on the shoulders of people who've done all this stuff before. To suggest that there's no difference in all of these cultures, that those differences are all false, when the empirical evidence suggests otherwise. In other words, you say, well, Islamic culture, Asian cultures, they're the same, right? It's just another culture. Well, I don't know, looking at the empirical evidence, one culture has led to more freedom and affluence and a higher standard of living, lower infant mortality than any other. Now, none of them are perfect. That's not the point. None of them are going to be perfect because they're all created by imperfect human beings. But it's indifferent. It's insane to suggest that they're the same when the results are clearly not the same. Okay? Now, you can get into arguments about why it happened, okay? And by the way, to say that one culture is superior to another is not to say that the human beings in that culture are inherently superior to all other human beings and therefore more deserving of things. It's not to say that at all. That's, again, indifference. If you suggest that, well, you're not seeing the difference between examining a culture and making some kind of racial or I don't know, inherently superior argument, okay? It isn't... We were born into a particular culture. It doesn't make us inherently superior human beings. It means we're luckier, okay? But it also means, and this will be the topic of my next video, that we ought to be grateful and understand the difference between gratitude and resentment, and to try to defend that culture because it is better. Not that we're better human beings who deserve more things, but because the culture that we share, that we were lucky enough to be born into, is the one that lets me make a video talking to you guys about this stuff, and you to be able to watch it wherever you are, on a little screen or whatever. That's pretty awesome. And to be indifferent to that is nuts. It's insane. So again, we can talk more about this, and I will, because, you know, I think on the issues of diversity and whatnot, this whole thing where there's a logical dissonance, where cognitive dissonance, excuse me, where we're saying we're all the same but celebrate our differences. Okay, how does that work exactly, right? I mean, it's complicated, and so we need to understand that until, and as far as humanity goes and understanding different cultures, and right, we want all human beings to one brotherhood of man, and all that's true, right? But we need our differences, whether it's the nations of Europe. How do you expect a Greek fisherman to understand sacrifices he has to make for a Norwegian miner? The human brain can't do it. It's not made to, because it needs that difference. You want to tell him they're the same, but everything he's seeing tells him it's different. Not that he wishes ill on that other person, or that he thinks him less of a human being or less deserving. Nothing like that. But because he can't think without the difference. We need that to understand our own world, because our brains are limited, and we need difference to make sense of what's going on around us. So until an alien species, and this, to Gene Roddenberry's credit, is the great point of the Star Trek universe, which is first contact, right? Once there's a different other, another difference, a profound difference, an alien species, then mankind, because there's another other that they can define themselves against, then mankind can truly become one, because conceptually we can now think, okay, we're all humans, they're not human, okay, right? Lacking that, we need difference in the post-lapsarian, that is to say, after the fall condition, our condition, where we know everything by its difference from everything else. To eradicate differences, to promote insanity, right? Which is why it's important that we know the difference between doing right and being right, and that we remember that it's always more important to do right than it is to be right. Thanks for watching. Cheers.